Welcome to What Was That? Q&A on Egypt with Professor Chomsky. In Arabic, مساء الخير عليكم وأهلا وسهلا بيكم. This event, as you know, is hosted by the Egyptian Student Association at MIT. My name is Tariq Raha, and as the president of ESA, it is a pleasure to welcome you to this event on behalf of ESA's board and members. Our aim as a student group is to be a catalyst for forging an alliance between Egypt and MIT. And our objectives to achieve this are threefold: to support the development of the Egyptian economy, technological industry, scientific progress, civil society, and entrepreneurial spirit. We also aim to represent Egyptian culture on the MIT campus and the greater Boston region. To create a social community for Egyptians at MIT and Boston. And we've been supporting these objectives through many initiatives and events. And we gave you a glimpse of it in a brochure that you probably received as you came in. But we would love to communicate with you and keep you updated with what's happening in ESA. That is why we made sure we are on all forms of social media. So to learn more about us, please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you want to support us, we do welcome your donations as well. Just email us, and we'd be more than happy to further elaborate on this. We promise you a lot of fun and engaging events. A small statement on behalf of the MIT Egyptian Student Association. I would like to clarify that we as a student body have no political affiliation. The executive board and members of our associations do have varying political opinions, but we maintain our friendships and we all continue to represent our country with all our heart. Also on behalf of ESA, I would like to thank Professor Chomsky for generously accepting our invitation. We truly appreciate it. Special thanks go to Professor Nazli Shukri, who I will be introducing in a moment, and she will in turn introduce Professor Chomsky, for kindly accepting to moderate the Q&A session. There has been tremendous efforts and a lot of volunteer work, so allow me to acknowledge and thank the board and members of the Egyptian Student Association at MIT, to the ASA team. Without you, this would not have been the success we see. In terms of marketing, outreach, careful employment of IT, and amazing leadership and event planning. Thank you. I would also like to thank members of the Egyptians in Boston community who heed the call diligently. You've met a lot of them on your way in. We are grateful to the CAC, MIT AV, MIT Police, and the LAF fund we received to partially fund this event. And finally, I have to say, it is quite the honor to welcome Professor Chomsky and to introduce Professor Shukri, and we are very happy to have you. Professor Nazli Shukri is a professor of political science at MIT. Her research concentrates on sources and consequences of international transformations and change with a focus on international conflict and cooperation. She is the architect and director of the Global System for Sustainable Development, GSSD, a multilingual web-based knowledge networking system, and principal investigator of a multi-year, multidisciplinary collaborative research project of MIT and Harvard University on explorations in cyber international relations. She is the founding editor of the MIT Press series on Global Environment Accord and the former general editor of the International Political Science Review. Her most recent book is Cyber Politics and International Relations, MIT Press 2012. Please help me in welcoming Professor Shukri.
Thank you. So, friends, colleagues, and ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce a gentleman tonight, Noam Chomsky, who really needs no introduction. But protocol requires that he be introduced. So very briefly, I shall do so and begin by telling you what you already know, and that is Noam Chomsky is a distinguished scientist, a distinguished scholar, and a political philosopher. At the present time, he is the Professor Emeritus of Linguistics at MIT, where he has taught really all of his career. As most of you know, he is best known as the theorist of transformative generative grammar. And in the process of doing my research for this introduction, I've learned a lot about transformative grammar, generative grammar. And I won't share with you my understanding of it with the theorist right here. A couple more important items from an MIT perspective, and that is that Professor Chomsky is an institute professor. He became so in 1976, and that is the greatest honor that a faculty member can receive at MIT for contributions, professional contributions, scholarly contributions, as well as contributions to the MIT community. Among other things, he has received 10 honorary university degrees from around the world, and he has been, for a long, long, long time, the 8th most cited intellectual in the scientific literature. And he's clearly recognized as one of the most influential living scholars in the world. And before I turn it over to Professor Chomsky, let me just suggest or tell you what the rules of the game are for this evening. Questions, please keep them as concise as possible so that we can cover as many questions as possible. And the second thing is, if you don't mind, it's one question at a time so that we can move on. So thank you. And with this, turn it over to Professor Chomsky.
The fact that I'm standing here in front of a large audience in a big auditorium may be misleading, so let me quickly allay any misimpressions. I'm here basically to open a discussion. I don't pretend to have any deep understanding of the remarkable events that have been taking place in Egypt in recent years. I follow them as closely as I can, but haven't researched them deeply, and many of the sources, the most important ones that are in Arabic, I haven't had access to. Another reason for my own hesitation is that I find myself in a kind of surprising disagreement with some of my old friends, good friends in Egypt, people whose judgment I've always respected and whose actions I've regarded with much admiration. I'll try to explain why as I proceed. First, give a quick review of some of the most important events, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So beginning in January 2011, the uprising, or some call it revolution, took place. Tahrir Square was occupied, set in motion a chain of spectacular events that led very quickly to the fall of the dictator, US-backed dictator, many other achievements, lively political atmosphere opened up, much opportunity, and which was made good use of for freedom of association, interchange, speech. Some of the most important achievements were scarcely reported here, except in the specialist literature, had to do with labor rights. Egypt had quite a militant and active labor movement for many years. Outside the official framework, there was an official state union, which, as usual, was more committed to controlling the workforce than working for their interests. But outside of that institutional structure, there was militant labor activism taking place. It accelerated roughly 10 years ago as the neoliberal programs were instituted more severely, as just about everywhere in the world, including here. As these programs were instituted, they had pretty standard consequences. One was that they were highly praised by the international financial institutions, World Bank and the IMF, US Treasury, many economists, and they had numbers that looked good. But underneath the numbers, they had the usual consequences. We're familiar with them here. Sharply rising inequality, very high concentration of wealth, elimination of social support systems, atomization of the population, extensive repression, unbounded corruption, usual effects around the world, which have led to uprisings almost everywhere. In Latin America, they've led to actually remarkable liberation of South America from 500 years of Western dominance. And what began in the Arab Spring was in Tunisia and in Egypt, was in part an uprising against the imposition of the harsh neoliberal regime, combined with opposition to a brutal dictatorship that, of course, the U.S. was strongly supporting. And there were major achievements in labor rights very quickly. The labor movement was not initially directly involved in the uprising, the Tahrir Square occupation, but it began to join very soon and provided a substantial mass basis for it. A general strike was one of the main factors that impelled the military command, SCAF, to decide to shelve the dictator, Mubarak. An independent union was formed for the first time outside the framework of the legal structure that broke the monopoly of the state labor union. The involvement of the labor movement in the uprising added social and economic demands to the narrower political goals, and they also made substantive achievements, raise of the minimum wage, new unions, much else. The scholar who does most of the work on this, Joel Bainin of Stanford, reviews it extensively and points out that one of the main achievements was perhaps more subtle. It was just simply providing human dignity and a voice to people who had been so suppressed and marginalized that they had none. All of that was of a great concern to the United States and its allies. They don't like such developments. And that was particularly kind of accelerated by the studies of public opinion in Egypt at the time, Egypt and much of the Arab world. These were conducted by major U.S. polling agencies, and they're certainly well known to planners and elite elements. They were not reported, barely mentioned in the United States in the media, but barely mentioned. But they're interesting and revealing for us and helpful for understanding the U.S. attitude towards the developments that have taken place, U.S. official attitudes. In Egypt, at the time of the Tahrir Square occupation, a major poll taken by one of the main U.S. polling agencies found that about a very high percentage of the population, roughly 80%, regarded the greatest threat that they face as being the United States and Israel. They dislike Iran. All through the Arab world, there's sharp dislike of Iran. But as elsewhere, they didn't regard Iran as much of a threat. Maybe 10% regarded Iran as a threat. In fact, opposition to U.S. policy was so strong among the population that a majority in Egypt actually thought that the region might be more secure if Iran developed nuclear weapons to offset U.S. and Israeli power. Well, if you have a really functioning democracy, popular opinion is going to influence policy. And it's pretty obvious that the United States doesn't want these policies implemented. And as usual, the fear of democracy guided much of U.S. policy, both suppression of the information for the public here, but also the policy actions. That's actually quite normal. There were elections. The elections were won by Islamists, mostly the Muslim Brotherhood. They had been the best organized group for many years. They were illegal most of the time under the dictatorship, but they functioned. And the organization enabled them, was one of the factors that enabled them to win the elections. The other was that there was many splits in the secular left liberal quasi-coalition, which actually got a majority of the votes. More than half of the Egyptians voted for what was called a revolutionary candidate from those sectors in the last summer's presidential elections. But there were 6 accredited candidates from those groups, and that was split, so the Brotherhood easily won. Salafists took a big role. They imposed a regime which was pretty harsh. SCAF, the military command, maintained its a very powerful role in the dominating the society. The government made only limited efforts to share governance, became quite unpopular. By this year, there was a major uprising, June 30th, a huge outpouring of people into the streets, petitions calling for the government to resign. A couple of days later came the military takeover on July 3rd. Well, that's part of the background. My own personal aspirations and sympathies, and in fact friends, are mostly with the mass popular June 30th uprising movement. But I think they're making a serious error in their support for the military coup, or for many of them, even the outright denial that a coup took place, and in their faith in the commitment of the military to defend what they call the people against the Brotherhood. Now, that's a term that should be avoided. The people are badly split. Maybe you may not like the Brotherhood, you may not like their actions, but they're there, and they're a substantial part of the population. And the people, they can't be written off. So reference to the people already tells you something's misleading in the commentary, severely so. Also mistaken, in my view, is their faith that the military is going to move to establish a democratic secular regime. I think that's highly unlikely. And much more likely is that the military will act the way the military acts everywhere, and historically in Egypt as well. It'll impose, and has already imposed, a harsh, brutal regime. Its aim will be to reinforce their own power over the political system, and also to sustain and their control over quite a substantial economic empire. They'll crush dissidents, undermine civil and human rights. It's already happening. My unpleasant expectation is that my friends, the secular liberal left opposition that has welcomed the military, are likely to be its victims pretty soon, as has happened in the past and is beginning to happen now. One of the most best informed international correspondents in the region, Patrick Coburn, wrote recently after return from Egypt that Egypt is on the brink of a new dark age as the generals close in for the kill, with 10 retired generals and 2 police commanders from the Mubarak era being appointed provincial governors. Egypt is effectively under military rule. There is, of course, huge support from Saudi Arabia and other elements of the most reactionary parts of the Islamic world. The West prefers them to the Brotherhood. The West, the United States, like Britain before it, tended overwhelmingly to support the most extreme radical Islamists in opposition to secular nationalism for understandable reasons, and they don't happen to like the Brotherhood particularly, but that's a different matter. Saudi Arabia and the Salafis are way to their extreme side. It's possible, Coburn predicts, that this may lead to a bloody civil war. Joel Binen, the specialist on Egyptian Labor writes that security forces, after the military takeover, quickly crushed a militant strike at the Suez, I'm quoting him, at the Suez Steel Company, located in the Canal Zone city that, not coincidentally, was in the vanguard of the revolutionary forces that compelled Mubarak to step down. No matter how popular the army may be at the moment, workers now face an emboldened authoritarian state that is openly hostile to their rights and aspirations. I suspect he's correct. As I said, there have been real gains, maybe lasting ones, but they're in danger, and I think the danger is quite serious. Right now, there are two major power centers. One is Islamist, the other is the military, the latter very much in the ascendance, and with substantial left liberal secular support, which, as I said, I think is a mistake. 2 weeks ago, a new initiative was launched. It's calls itself Revolution Path Front. The main state newspaper, Al-Ahram, describes it as a new anti-brotherhood, anti-military front launched to achieve revolution goals. Contains well-known political figures, activists, labor leaders, and others. The spokesperson at the press conference where they announced themselves was Awal Gamal. He's quite an impressive young left economist. Met him a couple months ago in Egypt. He writes, he said at the press conference, "It has been 2.5 years since the revolution began, and Egyptians have not yet achieved their dream of building a new republic that will provide them with democracy, justice, and equality. Millions have taken to the streets twice, once in January 2011 to topple Mubarak's regime, which was based on corruption and oppression, and a second time in June 2013, forcing Mohamed Morsi to step down after losing legitimacy as a result of the Brotherhood's attempts to monopolize political life and rebuild an oppressive system." According to Al-Ahram, the aim of the front is to work for the redistribution of wealth, achieve social justice, combat the formation of an oppressive regime, achieve equality between citizens, set the path for transitional justice, and adopt foreign policies that guarantee national independence. If it does, that also guarantees U.S. opposition to it. Is this possible? I don't know. I hope it is. I think it looks like the best hope right now to save Egypt from what might become one of the darkest periods of its history under military rule. Thank you.
If you allow me, I will make, stay there, right there. One brief comment and then a question. My comment has to do with the role of the young people. I don't know how to put it. The generations younger, many generations younger than the older ones, in mobilizing in the early phase. It's a generation that's much more skilled, much more educated, much more in tune with global thinking and global processes, and of course, access to communication. So the age structure should be fitted in the dynamics. The question I have, and depending on your answer, I may have a follow-up question, and that is, are there any conditions under which you might consider it plausible, acceptable, I won't say good, but acceptable, to have a military intervention and a military coup?
Are there any conditions? Well, you can imagine conditions, but I think there's a very heavy burden of proof to be met by anyone who advocates a military coup anywhere, in particular in Egypt, with the quite ugly history of the military, which incidentally, as you know, persisted right through the Morsi period and has been picked up again afterwards. The crushing of the Suez Strike is an unfortunate example.
Well, I would be the last to support or endorse or say anything nice about any military, but there is one aspect we haven't really touched upon. I'll just make a comment and not a question so we can go over. And this is that we have seen the very gradual but very persistent loss of law, of order, of any kind of police protection. Not that there was much to begin with, but the indicator there is when individual citizens carry their own guns and when there's a private circulation of weaponry for legitimate self-protection, then the textbook at least says that it's an indication of the erosion of the social order. And I, for one, would consider that not a justification, but if there are no other institutions that can provide to the normal citizen some minimum amount of security other than the military, in some ways it's difficult to reject that. Now, how to contain that and how to make it temporary and how to fire the military after they've done their job is another question. So I think with that, we can begin addressing questions directly to Professor Chomsky. We have 2 microphones, and
thank you very much. If the criticisms of the Morsi and Muslim Brotherhood government are legitimate to some significant degree, what might have been an alternative direction for people in Egypt to have responded to their fears and their insecurities? And could it be that Morsi made a political and strategic mistake insofar as he may have, as I understand it, accepted the neoliberal economic policies that you made reference to? And connected with that, a mutual friend of ours who helped found Partners in Health down the street here in Cambridge is now the head of the World Bank, Jim Kim. And so could you comment on the role of institutions like the World Bank in this ongoing scenario?
Well, that's a couple of different questions. It's true that the Morsi government essentially continued with the neoliberal programs. Whether that was a mistake or not depends on your point of view. It was a mistake from the point of view of the population because these programs harmed them. On the other hand, if he hadn't undertaken them, the U.S. and its allies would have moved very quickly to support his overthrow, because that's the condition that they require for acceptance of a regime. And the regime was weak enough so it might have happened. As for Jim Kim, who's a good friend, an old friend of mine, he did take on the presidency of the World Bank, and I think with eyes open and with hopes of changing its direction, and we'll have to see, how far he can achieve those goals. I don't personally criticize him for taking it. I don't think it's possible to just say, I'm going to dissociate myself from all institutions because they're too oppressive and brutal, and that's a possible position, but another one is to try to find a way within them to ameliorate their worst actions and effects. And that's beginning to happen with the IMF as well. So the IMF, for example, has essentially pulled out of the troika that has imposed this brutal austerity program on mainly Southern Europe, and the IMF has backed off. In fact, has come out with studies arguing, I think, demonstrating that the austerity programs under recession are the worst possible. Well, okay. There are economists within the IMF who are pressing that. I think I don't criticize them for that. As for the first part of the question about what alternatives were there for the people, first of all, we should be cautious. It's not the people. It's a segment of the people that is opposed to the Brotherhood and the Salafis. What the exact proportions are, we don't really know. One very well-informed analyst, Alain Gresh, estimates that maybe a third of the population supports the Brotherhood, and others, the Salafis, or even to the more extreme end. But it's split. And the question is, what could the others have done? Well, there's some answers. As I mentioned, in the last summer's presidential election, they split 6 ways. They had a majority, but they were too busy fighting each other to form a coalition which could have won the presidency. Well, there are other elections coming, and so far at least they're not perfect by any means, all kind of things wrong with them. But relatively speaking, they were more or less open elections, and there's a fairly open society. So they could have participated in that and taken a parliamentary road to eliminating the Morsi regime. Part of the reason why they didn't, I think, is they were by no means confident that they would be able to follow that path. But then, here we don't agree in our assessments, but my feeling is that calling in the military to do it for you doesn't improve security. It leads to what we've in fact already seen. First, real massacres of the Brotherhood, hundreds of people killed, crushing of strikes in the major areas, and imposition of the kind of regime you'd expect from a military. Actually, some of you may have seen, I'm sure you saw this morning's newspapers, a long report of leaks about the SCAF military discussions, internal discussions under the Morsi regime, when their power was being somewhat, in limited ways, reduced. They were subjected to some degree of public scrutiny, at least. And the discussions headed by the new commander were designed to figure out ways to overcome the fact that they were under scrutiny and that their economic empire and political power might be in limited ways overcome, reduced. And I think the coup was mainly an attempt to ensure that that won't happen. I hope I'm wrong, but I suspect strongly that my own friends will be the ones who will suffer from their support for this action.
Could I please ask the next question to be concise and one question? Go ahead.
Hi, Professor Chomsky. So my question is, do you think the so-called stable countries of the world may be complacent in not anticipating such revolutions? So can such revolutions happen anywhere in the world?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't hear. I don't hear very well.
Have the countries of the world have been complacent, the Western countries, in understanding what's happening, and this could happen anywhere in the world?
Well, if you mean the Western governments, the countries of the world differ all over the place. The Western governments are by no means complacent, but they don't have the power that they used to have. Now, there are many, I'm sure you know, there are rumors circulating in the region, in Egypt, and in fact all over the Middle East, about the enormous power of the United States. It sort of runs everything. And in fact, on both sides of the divide in Egypt, there are accusations that the United States supports the other side and is manipulating and running everything. The same stories go on about Syria. I think that's very far from true. The U.S. and even more so its allies have very limited capacity to influence what's happening. Some, but limited, and not in the days like the days when they could institute military coups and so on and so forth. That's pretty much gone. But they're not complacent. They have goals. So the United States, for example, is very concerned about the interests of its major allies. Its major allies are the Saudi dictatorship and Israel. And both of them happen to be strong supporters of the military regime. So yes, the United States, for that and other reasons, I think will continue to support the military regime. Not that it implemented the coup, it didn't, but to support the outcome. Particularly if the military regime persists in the policies it has so far initiated of attacking the independent labor movement, undermining rights, and so on. That's the kind of thing that the U.S. supports pretty naturally. The reaction to the poll results I mentioned is a good example. Actually, just to go on with that for a moment, since we ought to be interested in ourselves, it was extremely interesting to watch the elite reaction to what was revealed about the attitudes in the Arab world. WikiLeaks released documents showing that the Arab dictators, some of them gave pretty strong support to the U.S. with regard to Iran. And if you read the newspapers today, they'll talk with enthusiasm about how the Arabs support the harsh U.S. position towards Iran. Well, in fact, the reaction was so extreme that a number of leading commentators in the U.S. and Britain, Jacob Heilbrunn here, Gideon Rachman, and Financial Times in London, actually started joking about how it looks as though the CIA must be running WikiLeaks because they released information that's so supportive of U.S. policy. Well, there's a slight footnote there. They were referring to the attitudes of the dictators. The attitudes of the population are radically different. But for people who have real contempt for democracy, what the people believe just is irrelevant. What matters is the dictators. And if they support us, everything's fine. If the population believes what I just reported, that's an irrelevance. That's an important insight into ourselves. So sure, they're watching and doing what they can, but what they can has limitations.
Sir.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky, for speaking today, and thank you to the Egyptian Student Association for holding this event. I just wanted to read you a quote and see how you respond to former General Hugh Shelton, who said that General Sisi has put an end to the new Middle East project. Had General Sisi not deposed Morsi, Egypt would have become another Syria, and its military would have been destroyed.
That's a prediction for which I don't see much basis. As I mentioned, there were opportunities within the parliamentary system to continue to function. There were threats, undoubtedly. There was repression, much of it coming from the military itself under the Morsi regime. They did not back off from their harsh and authoritarian behavior. In fact, you can see it in the reports that were leaked this morning and in their actions. So yes, they were there, but there still were openings, and I don't see any indication that it was going to turn into Syria. In fact, I think probably the opposite. I suspect that Patrick Coburn is correct in concluding, as I mentioned, that the military takeover and the dark age that it portends and the harsh, brutal attack on the Brotherhood, which is a large part of the population, whatever you think about them, may lead to a bloody civil war. That could conceivably lead to maybe something like Syria, maybe worse. But I don't think there were real indications of it before that.
Sir?
Sir, over the past 2 or 3 years, people have witnessed both the Muslim Brotherhood and the military in power. And based on that, do you think we are going to have a break from political Islam for the next maybe 10 or 15 years? And if this is the case, do you think the Western model of democracy is the best path for Egypt and Middle Eastern countries for modernity and development?
Do I think that democracy is the best path?
The Western model of democracy.
Well, the Western model of democracy is quite anti-democratic. We should be honest about that. So, I mean, the elite opposition to democracy in the United States applies at home as well. We could talk about it. But if you mean the theoretical Western model, the one that's presented in propaganda and ideology, yeah, I think that's a good model. But powerful concentrations of power within the West and elsewhere don't want it. They don't want it here, they don't want it in Egypt. Is it the best model? Yeah, I think so. I think that's why it's constantly undermined. I should mention that there's nothing new about this. For those of you who want to learn about it, you should look a little at the history. The United States happens to be a very open society, so we have unusual access to internal planning. It's not used very much, but it's there. So just to take one illustration, back over 50 years ago, 1958, President Eisenhower, this is declassified, long declassified material, President Eisenhower raised a question with his staff in internal discussion. He asked, why is there a campaign of hatred against us in the Arab world, and not among the governments, which tend to support us, but among the population? Now, that was pretty surprising at the time, because this is 1958. And shortly before that, Eisenhower had intervened to kick Britain, France, and Israel out of Egypt. You might have thought that that would have led to some support in the populations of the Arab world. Instead, there was a campaign of hatred. Right at the same time, the National Security Council, highest planning body, released internally, published a document, a detailed document on developments inside the Arab world. And what they said is that there's a perception in the Arab world, these are almost quotes, a perception in the Arab world that the United States supports harsh and brutal dictatorships and opposes democracy and development, and that we do it because we want to make sure we control their energy resources, okay? And it went on to say that this perception is more or less accurate, as indeed it was, and that's probably the right thing for us to do. So yes, there's a campaign of hatred, and that reiterates over the years. You may recall that President Bush, right after 9/11, had a kind of pathetic speech in which he asked, why do they hate us? You know, he said, well, they hate us because of our freedom and our wonderful so-and-so. Shortly after that, the Pentagon had a study done by a research institute in the Pentagon, Defense Science Board, which came out with an analysis of a comment on Bush's speech. And essentially, they reiterated what the National Security Council had said back in 1958. They don't hate our freedoms, they hate our policies. They hate our policy of undermining democracy, support undermining development, supporting brutal and harsh regimes because of our interest in controlling their resources. And there's plenty of information in between that says the same thing, including polls. So I'd expect that to continue. But as to whether this would be a good model, yeah, I think it would. Not just for the Middle East, but for everywhere, here too.
In an email interview with Austin Meckel, you said, there have been bills of particulars offered by June 30th supporters of varying credibility, but I've seen nothing to justify the calling in the military to overthrow the elected government, however flawed the elections or objectionable the post-election policies. So my question is, why were the bills of particulars of varying credibility, in your opinion, and why can't the people overthrow the government if the elections were flawed or the post-election policies were objectionable? Are you objecting just the military interference, or you thought that wanting to overthrow the government was kind of premature?
Let me repeat what I think I understood. I didn't hear most of it. If you want to overthrow the government First of all, do I think that's legitimate? Sure, I thought it's very legitimate. As I said, my sympathies and friends are with the June 30th uprising. But is the best way to do it to call in the military to overthrow the government, institute a military dictatorship? No, I don't think that's the best way. If there's absolutely no alternative, and there's a major attack going on against the population, you can imagine a situation in which it might make sense to appeal to the military to intervene, but I don't think anything like that was true in Egypt.
And why did you think that the bills of particulars were of varying credibility?
Why do I?
You said that the bills of particulars in June 30th were of varying credibility.
I don't think I got that either.
Well, he said that
The bills of particulars of the June 30th movement were not credible.
Oh, no, I didn't. No, I didn't say that at all. The bill of particulars of the June 30th movement was mostly quite credible. I think the charges against the Morsi government were quite real, pretty accurate, maybe not every word, but basically correct. But the question is, given the opposition to the government on the part of a very large part of the population, maybe a majority, is the right mechanism under those circumstances to call for to support a military coup, which installs in power a much harsher government.
What would have been?
Pardon?
What would have been the alternative?
The alternative was to pursue the openings that were not pursued just a few months earlier in the presidential election, where to repeat, the secular left liberal forces, not a coalition, did have a majority of the vote, but were so preoccupied with fighting one another that they split the vote 6 ways. Okay? That offers opportunities. Overcome the factional conflicts internal to this sector and move forward to participate seriously in the parliamentary regime, which still was open, flawed, but open. And in fact, some of the main threats to that regime, even under Morsi, were the military, were SCAF.
Okay, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is Stan Lawrence, and I'm with Revolution Books and Revolution Newspaper. And I wanted to read a brief quote from Bob Avakian, who's the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, and get a comment. The essence of what exists in the U.S. is not democracy, but capitalism, imperialism, and political structures to enforce the capitalism, imperialism. What the U.S. spreads around the world is not democracy, but imperialism and political structures to enforce that imperialism. It seems to me that the situation in Egypt is a perfect example of that, where on one hand you have the reactionary fundamentalists, and on the other hand you have the military, which is part of the government, which has been funded and backed by the U.S. for 30 years. And I'd like to kind of explore that more in terms of this idea of what's involved in the people overthrowing the government.
Well, the quote from Chairman Bob is a harsher version of what I was saying. I think too harsh a version. I mean, I don't think the United States, I think that's an exaggerated picture of what the United States is like and what it does in the world. But there's an element of truth to it. In fact, it's pretty much what the National Security Council said in 1958. That we don't have to go to Bob Avakian for that. The rest of the question, if I understood it, kind of suggests that the United States was somehow responsible for imposing the Morsi government and the military regime afterwards. And I don't think that's true. The United States supported Mubarak strongly, right up to the last minute. In fact, what the U.S. policy was kind of straight out of a normal playbook. It's kind of intriguing that commentators here in the media and even scholarship didn't report the obvious. I mean, there's case after case where the United States has supported some favored dictator, and at some point it becomes impossible to sustain him. because maybe the military turns against him, as happened in Egypt. And at that point, there's a playbook. What you do is proclaim your love of democracy, make sure the intellectuals echo it, shelve the dictator, send him off somewhere. In Egypt, they would send him off to Sharm el-Sheikh, and then try to reinstitute the same regime. That's happened so often, it's almost a joke. You know, Somoza, Marcos, Duvalier, Suharto, Mobutu, it's kind of routine. So yes, that's what they did this time.
At least there's consistency.
What?
There is consistency.
Consistently, yeah, it's almost always. That's a very rational approach, you know, very simple. There's no reason to be deluded by it. It happens so often, we ought to just kind of laugh when we see it again. But that's not the way it was presented. That's the job of the intellectuals, to conceal all of this from themselves and from others. But to believe that the U.S. overthrew Mubarak is wrong. They supported him, just as in the other cases. They didn't impose the Brotherhood government. They won because they were better organized, much better. They had functioned right through the dictatorship. Let me just give you a personal anecdote. It's personal, so it's not a big story. But I was in Egypt about 20 years ago for a while, teaching at the American University. And while I was there, I spent a lot of time with activist intellectuals. One group was the kind of sort of the left, really good people, good friends. Sid Ahmed, others, really good, courageous people. They'd struggled hard. They'd spent many of them had spent years in Nasser's prisons being tortured. Very dedicated people. Now, that was the left. Where did we meet? Well, we met in a Nile riverboat. If you know anything about Egypt, you know what this is. They have these riverboats in the Nile for very rich tourists. And they had a friend who owned one of them. So he gave them the riverboat for our lunch, and we sat in one little corner of this thing and had an elegant lunch and talked about how to carry out a revolution in Egypt. That was the left. Now, later I met with a group of people who called themselves Islamic intellectuals. Actually, they were about as Islamic as I am. One of them was a Copt. One of them was the former editor of the Communist Party newspaper. But they declared themselves Islamic intellectuals. And we met in a small room somewhere and talked, and they described what they were doing, and I think accurately. They were trying to work in the slums, you know, set up clinics, small stores, organize people, and so on. That's what they were doing. The left intellectuals were having elegant dinners in riverboats. It wasn't hard to see who's going to win. And that's happened all over the region. Just as a personal anecdote, but in fact, it's been going on all over the region. The Brotherhood won for that reason, primarily. The United States didn't do it, and the United States didn't overthrow them. The United States was pretty happy with the Morsi regime. It was doing pretty much what they wanted. I think they prefer the military regime, partly because their major allies are so supportive of it, but also partly because it does carry out pretty harsh repression, like smashing up the strike in Suez. But that's my estimate. We don't have internal documents on this, so it's an impression.
Please.
Thank you very much for doing this, and I just wanted to, your previous comments kind of touched a little bit on what I'm about to ask. And basically, with the first revolution in January of 2011, do you believe the seeds of the current failure were placed in that because the revolution was incomplete? They overthrew Mubarak and the parliament, but they did not get rid of the judiciary, which was also part of the Mubarak regime, as well as the current generals. They were all part of the Mubarak regime. And you see this when Mubarak was tried. Yeah, he was convicted, but everything that was used to convict him was thrown out, setting him up for an appeal. which basically shows that this regime was setting itself up for a victory later on, which is what we're seeing right now, that it laid these seeds, that it knew that the first elected president was most likely going to fail because of the almost insurmountable problems, but also because of, as was stated earlier, lack of security equals lack of stability. The military was very lax in providing. Was very lax.
Lax?
In providing security, even down to the police forces. The police weren't doing their jobs.
The police were withdrawn. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was so on such a scale that it was almost appeared to be institutionalized, that they wanted security to fail, so that whatever government was in place that was not part of the regime would fail. So my question would be, do you believe this is an accurate scenario? And how does Egypt move forward? How will the next revolution take place and overthrow all branches of government and institute a true political democracy?
Yeah. Oh, I think you're quite right about the fact that the military, it retained its force under Morsi, quite a lot of it, and he reduced some of the privileges, but not much. They did they were quite happy with insecurity. The police were pulled out. And in fact, you saw what happened the day the military coup took place. The day the military coup took place, the police were back on the streets. Gas was available. Before that, you couldn't get any gas for your car. Saudi Arabia poured in tons of money in the Gulf Emirates. And it became very clear, if it wasn't before, that there had been every effort on the part of the military and the ultra-reactionary forces in the Arab world, mainly Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, to try to prevent any regime from functioning. They hated the Muslim Brotherhood. And then, they kind of reinstituted a sort of stability under a harsh military regime once they had gotten rid of the parliamentary opposition. That's pretty much what happened, I think. But the answer to that is not to support the military. That just makes it worse. What was the answer? Well, my impression is that there were, as I said before, there were plenty of openings to pursue unification of the sharply divided left secular forces, left liberal secular forces, this big grouping, and plenty of differences within them, but some kind of grouping. It could have gotten together. Actually, when I was in Egypt a couple of months ago, I met several of the political leaders of these factions, and it was pretty clear they just didn't want to cooperate with one another. They were more interested in fighting each other than doing something about the Morsi regime. But that could have been overcome, and I hope that this new front that was just announced, that I quoted from at the end, which has some quite good people in it, may be able to bridge those conflicts and create a unified movement which would proceed if parliamentary openings are still permitted by the military. They may not be.
The related point here is for us to remember that democracy, political participation, call it democracy in this case, involves bargaining, negotiation, giving in, and so forth. And part of it is learned behavior. And there hasn't been much experience in modern Egyptian history for learning how to overcome those divisions and so forth. Please.
Thank you, Professor Chomsky. I have a little question, just about the alternative again. We have seen in the year of the government of Morsi that the Muslim Brotherhood is nothing more than Mubarak regime in terms of political freedom, in terms of economic policy. The population, I think, found itself between the ex-dictator and the new dictator, and it has to choose between a growing dictatorship and a falling dictatorship, actually. making an alliance with the military would be my better choice. Let me disagree with you, because in this year we saw how they disseminated their men in all the administrative, local administration, as governors of about half of the governments of Egypt were ruled by Muslim Brotherhood. That was for the preparation for the next election. So they were preparing for a new dictatorship. It was evidence, I think. So if I have to choose, I would choose to make an alliance with the military again, which is falling actually, which has to reformulate its relationship with the power again.
First of all, I would suggest reformulating what you said. It's not the population that had to choose. It's a sector of the population to which you belong, and which I happen to sympathize with, but it's not the population. A large part of the population supported the Brotherhood. Another sector supported the Salafis, even more extreme. You can't just write them out of existence because you don't like them. They're there, they're important, they're organized, they're based in the population. In fact, they were so well organized that they were able to win just about every parliamentary choice that came along, partly because of the failures of the opposition, secular, liberal left. But they did do it, and they're still there. Maybe you can crush and murder and destroy them, but they're part of the population. So to reformulate your question, what could the sectors... First of all, I don't agree that, just factually, that the Morsi regime was as dictatorial and autocratic as the Mubarak dictatorship. There were real achievements that were made by the uprising revolution, if you like. I ran through some of them. There was much more freedom of expression, freedom of publication, meetings, freedom of association. There was a pretty vigorous, lively political atmosphere that didn't exist before. And there were some very concrete achievements, particularly for labor rights. The formation of the first independent union, and in fact dozens of new unions, was not a small development. The significant improvement in the minimum wage, which was quite serious. Things were happening that didn't happen under Mubarak and couldn't have happened. And there were openings for political action, for example, in the last presidential election, which may have persisted to the next one if they had been pursued. But given the actual situation, what should the part of the population that you, and in fact I, associate ourselves with, what should they have done? I think my feeling is what I suggested. They should have worked hard to overcome factional differences, agreed to find a way to work together, participate in the openings that were there, and try to achieve a parliamentary outcome which could then allow them to carry forward their programs. But I think the worst thing to do is to call in the military, which is going to crush these opportunities.
No, hold it, sir.
Hi, sir. I just want to refer back to 2011, when the military got control after Mubarak. Why didn't he call that a coup? That's number one.
When the military took over after Mubarak?
Yes, that was 2011. The military got involved, and they made an interim government at the same time, like the one that's happening now, and no one called that a coup. Question two, why risk Morsi?
It's one question, please.
It's a very, very, very small question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Continue it as part of the sentence of the first question, and blah, blah. Otherwise, no.
Can I just say it? It's really, really simple. Why risk Morsi on our aid between U.S. and Egypt? And why Morsi is that important to the U.S.? And I think
Let me stop this one. Do the first one. The first one is important.
Sorry, what was the question?
No,
I heard the first part.
Yeah, I don't get the Morsi question, but he's violating
the rule of the House. So why wasn't it a military coup in March 2011?
No, I mean when Mubarak left, the military got involved.
March 2011.
Yeah.
Yeah. So why wasn't that a military coup?
Yes.
Well, because it was kind of like the overthrow of Marcos or Somoza, where at the last minute, when the military realized they could no longer maintain their own dictator, they sent him off to pasture, and they handed the government over to a popular government. That's not a military coup. It's a decision by the military that we can no longer maintain our own dictator, and the best we can do at the moment is subordinate ourselves to a civilian government. That's quite different from a military coup.
Sir?
Thank you for being here, Professor. My question is, what is the relationship between extremism and repressive social action in an age of austerity? In other words, how does Egyptian social action buttress the extremist ideologies? For example, Sayyid Qutb, him being in prison led to an extremist ideology.
Like the Salafi positions or the Saudi positions?
Right.
Is that what you mean by extremist?
Right.
Now, I'd call them extremists too, you know. But I mean, what's extremist depends on your point of view. I mean, they'd probably regard us as extremists, you know. I mean, it's not a descriptive term. It's a term reflecting your own position in some kind of spectrum. But yes, from our point of view, they're extremists. But then what's the question?
Done. Miss? Mm-hmm. This is dictatorship right here. Good.
On June 30th, with 30 million people in the streets, and the majority of them wanting Mubarak to step down and wanting the same results that they got from the January 25th revolution, I in no way support the military coup, but what do you think would have been a solution in that situation on that day?
On June 30th?
Mm-hmm.
Well, first of all, I'd be kind of skeptical about the numbers, as independent observers are. But there's no doubt there were plenty of people in the streets. There was a large popular uprising. The proper move at that point, I think, I'll just repeat it, would be to use that momentum to overcome the destructive, stultifying divisions, factionalism in the kind of left, liberal, secular sector, and to put forth a unified opposition which would participate actively in the openings that were plainly there. Not to call in the military, which is going to put a damper on all of it. And in fact, remember, the military itself was responsible for a substantial part of the repression under the Morsi regime. Bringing them in is not a sensible step. I mean, I have to say what I said at the beginning. My own friends, good friends in Egypt, people I really respect, disagree quite sharply with what I just said. So I say it with hesitation, but that's what it looks like to me.
Sir?
Hi, do you think in the future it will be possible for the left to work with the Islamists, or at least...
To?
Do you think it would be possible for the left, the more secular segment of society, to work with the Islamists in the future, or at least tolerate each other? And if not, how big of a problem would that be?
Well, certainly at the moment, at least as far as I can see at the moment, there don't seem to be open opportunities for that. What might happen in the future, who knows? So take, say, Latin America, different situation, but just take that as a model. I mean, for centuries, the Catholic Church, in fact, since the 4th century, had been the church of the persecutors, the church that supported autocracy, power, violence, and so on. In 1962, with Vatican II, that changed. The Vatican II was an effort to, under Pope John XXIII, to reinstitute the Gospels in the Catholic Church. That was a radical act because the Gospels are a radical document. That's why Christians were persecuted in the first couple of centuries. They tried to introduce what was called the preferential option for the poor, the message of the Gospels. It was taken up in Latin America, by priests, nuns, lay people, tried to organize peasants, and so on. What happened? The United States went to war with them, initiated a vicious war against the church, left a long string of murder of corpses, many of them religious martyrs, and it's left. Part of that was the overthrow of the parliamentary government's institution of dictatorships, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile, the massacres in Central America in the 1980s, ended in 1989 with the murder of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals in the university in El Salvador by an elite battalion armed and trained by the United States, fresh from training at the John F. Kennedy Counterinsurgency School in North Carolina, following the orders of the military, top command, to murder the Jesuits and anyone else who was around. Okay, that was the war against the church. Just a couple of days ago, another step was taken. The current ultra-right Archbishop of El Salvador disbanded tutela legal, that's the legal office of the church during the heresy, the period of the heresy when they tried to restore the Gospels. There was a research agency of the church in El Salvador, tutela legal, which compiled information on the murders, the atrocities, the killings, and so on. A couple days ago, it was disbanded by the Archbishop, I'm sure with U.S. support. The war still goes on. Is that possible in the Muslim world? Maybe. And it would have the same response.
Professor Chomsky, thank you for joining us today, and thank you for a lifelong, a long life of contribution to the advancement of social justice and political activism. And thank you for the Egyptian Student Association for making this event possible and opening our minds to your thoughts. My question is regarding an environmental issue in Egypt. At the end of Morsi's year-long regime, he tried to consolidate a bitterly divided public opinion by addressing the potential of upstream threat of limiting Nile use and Nile access. So what potential do you think that future regimes will have in consolidating and swaying public opinion on a unifying issue like the Nile River access, as well as using that to the advantage of their political interests?
It's quite an important issue. In fact, came pretty close to a war with Ethiopia over damming the sources of the Nile. And that remains a live issue. I don't know. Maybe you can say something. I have no idea how that can be resolved. I think it's a very difficult, latent problem. There are other ways that these issues could be approached. Actually, one of them was suggested by a student at MIT a couple of years ago. I've forgotten his name. There was a student in the mechanical engineering department here, some of you may know him, Egyptian student, who worked on a project to develop a very cheap, easily accessible solar energy. It was essentially small sort of reflectors made out of materials that that Egyptians could construct themselves. Didn't require importation of high-tech equipment. According to his thesis, at least, and the professor who worked with him, it was a feasible approach. Egypt, in fact, North Africa altogether, the air is pretty clear. It's not heavily polluted. Plenty of sunlight. They estimated that they could, if this was spread over the country and over North Africa, they could have enough energy resources to even supply Europe, including their own. Well, that's another path of development. Is that feasible? You go to the mechanical engineering department here and ask them what they think, why they gave him a PhD for it.
Yeah?
My question is a bit more thematic. In respect to the mobilizing youth, military coups, and additional current involvement of the West, do you believe there is any similarity with Iran and the potential scales of government and/or resistance, or do you think that has grown to be impossible with Egypt?
Didn't understand.
Do you want to repeat it Slowly.
Yeah.
But slowly.
In respect to the mobilizing youth, the military involvement, the coups, and the general current involvement of the West, do you think there is any similarity with Iran and the potential scales of government or resistance? Or do you think that Egypt has, or that idea has become impossible for the conditions of Egypt?
Which idea?
The idea of resistance in general.
Of
resistance.
Resisting the generals?
No, resistance.
Resistance?
Iran, compare Iran and Egypt.
With regard to resistance to the government?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's quite a different structure. Iran is, they're both right, Egypt in the past couple of years has been fairly open by regional standards. In fact, maybe, aside from Tunisia, maybe the most open country. But now it's closing down with the military regime. Iran is a different story. It's under the rule of a very harsh clerical regime. It's not Egypt, where it's not a clerical regime, it's an anti-clerical regime. But it's pretty rough. But it does have, there still are openings. The last election was limited. You know, like every candidate in the Iranian election has to be vetted by the clerical council, you know, the clerics. So you can't just have any candidate running, which is, of course, intolerable, but shouldn't surprise us very much. We have a similar system. In the United States, every candidate has to be vetted by concentrations of private capital. If you can't put together billions of dollars, you're not a candidate. So we don't have clerics vetting the candidates. We have Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and the Koch brothers and so on vetting them, which is wrong in both cases. But something took place that wasn't just kind of, the population did participate. And the outcome was kind of a surprise. The most, not very, but the most reformist of the admitted candidates won pretty easily. And there's some changes. People in Iran, at least the ones I can hear from, are pretty happy with it. Well, there were more openings than that in Egypt. And could they have been pursued? I think they could have been. Will they be possible in the future? Well, we'll have to see. Depends what the military is going to permit.
Thank you, Professor. Much has been made about the role of social media in the events in Egypt and indeed throughout the Arab world. What's your assessment of the influence of social media, and has its effects been overblown?
You want to talk about it? I should. You answer. She's the expert on it, so I shouldn't talk about it. It's obviously there was an effect. How big the effect was, I think, it's not so clear in my opinion. So, for example, there was a point at which Mubarak closed down the internet to try to block the use of the internet for organizing activism and so on. It didn't stop the activism. It just took another form, and in fact, a pretty effective form through other forms of direct communication. So yes, they're useful, but it's not I don't think it's a revolutionary change. Many uprisings have been carried out and succeeded without the internet, before the internet. It can be used effectively. It can also be used, as we know, as a technique of control and domination. That's, just take a look at the Snowden revelations. The power systems, anyone, corporate or state, are going to use whatever technology they can get their hands on to try to control their domestic enemies, the population. We're seeing it very dramatically here. So it's a double-edged sword. It's true of most technology. Can be used to oppress, can be used to liberate.
Sir?
Many people in Egypt right now think it's the right time for the current regime to make a change of direction with regard to international policies and make a shift to the east and establish a powerful relationship with Russia and China like it used to be during the 60s, there was a very powerful relationship between Egypt and the Soviet Union. Do you think this is happening? Like China will be a big ally for Egypt in the next 10, 15 years?
China certainly has interest in the region, but for the time being, they appear to be primarily commercial interests. That's true all over the region. So, for example, one of the effects of the overthrow of Gaddafi in Libya was to drive out probably tens of thousands of Chinese engineers, oil prospectors, and others who were investing there, replace them by Westerners. Maybe something could happen in Egypt. I don't know of any indication that China has any great interest in substantial investment in Egypt. Egypt doesn't have major resources the way, say, Libya did, or the Congo, or so on.
Thank you, Professor. June 25th, 2011 was Police Day in Egypt and was also arguably a turning point in the revolution as it saw the mass mobilization of anti-regime forces. Sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm referring to Police Day in 2011, which was June 25th. It saw a mass mobilization of anti-regime protesters and was arguably a turning point in the early days of the revolution. I'm wondering if you believe that this October 6th, which will be the Armed Forces Day in Egypt, presents a similar opportunity for people discontent with the government, not only the pro-Morsi forces, but also anyone else who does not agree with the current regime, to mobilize, and if you think that this will also become a turning point in the modern events of Egypt.
In a couple of days.
Yeah, it's this Sunday.
Well, I mean, I don't know of any indication of it. Maybe you do. If there are people here who follow the blogs in Egypt or the press in Egypt in Arabic, they might have some indication of this, but I haven't seen anything.
Well, what I understand, this is through secondhand, and I could have misinterpreted, but the second hand can have the right to clarify, and that is that some indication that the not-so-legal Muslim Brotherhood might be engaged in making its presence felt again by slowing down just operations of the system. But in terms of violence, I haven't heard anything. It's very unlikely that the 6th of October will go by unnoticed. So that's what we...
The only indications I've seen are the ones I mentioned. The new Revolution Path Front, which grows out of something that was called the Third Square. Now, there was an informal development prior to this of what was called there were two squares. There was Tahrir Square, which was by then mostly military, and there was the Islamist Square, where they were organizing. And there was a third square, which included many of these people, and they have now formed themselves into some kind of a unified front, which covers a pretty broad range of activists and groups. How far they can go, I don't know. I personally like their policies and the people, but just don't know how much popular support they can get mobilized.
Firstly, I just want to thank you for coming to speak on this topic. My question has to do with the division in the population and how you say that you see it unlikely for the Islamists and the secular left to begin to cooperate. I'm wondering if you see any way for us to begin to bridge the gap in order to minimize the lack of security and the day-to-day violence that all Egyptians are suffering from regardless of their political views.
In Egypt, is there a possibility for the competing blocs to get together and cooperate?
Yeah, just in terms of minimizing the lack of security.
I'd like to believe it, but I think that the direction in which things are going are more like what Patrick Coburn described, towards what could turn out to be a bloody civil war. What you're suggesting would be very welcome, and there always are possibilities, but at least I don't see anything happening in that direction.
Can I ask you a question? Do you see anything optimistic
in Egypt?
At all?
Yeah, I think what's optimistic are the lasting achievements of the initial Tahrir Square uprising, including what I mentioned. Again, a much more lively political atmosphere, empowering of people, what Joel Biden pointed out, giving people a sense of dignity and voice, and the concrete achievements, mainly partly political participation, which was a real achievement, but partly the labor movement, which is very significant, I think. The establishment of the first institutional break with the Mubarak regime, the very first, was the establishment of the Egyptian Independent Trade Union Federation. That's significant. Before that, there had been no officially recognized independent union. Now it broke that monopoly, and since then there's been plenty of significant labor activism in the major centers, major textile centers, industrial centers, Suez. That's why the military clamped down so hard on them. But it's still there. And I think these are, in fact, one of the main labor leaders, Kamal Abbas, is part of this revolution path front. I don't know how many others are involved because there hasn't been much evidence, but I think those are so far lasting achievements. Can you go on from there? Well, I think that's optimistic.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, mine is a little broader question. So we saw that in Libya, it took a civil war for the transition from an autocracy to a democracy, what we see today, the new system. In Egypt, it took the intervention of the military. Against Syria, we've seen a civil war. My question is that for an autocracy/dictatorship in the Middle East, can there be an alternative route for transition to democracy that does not involve a civil war or a military intervention? Is there an optimal route apart from what we have seen so far?
Can there be in the Middle East democracy uprising without military intervention?
And a civil war. I mean, the dubious routes that we have seen so far that have brought more damage than benefit, can there be another optimal route?
Well, I would put it a little differently. Can there be moves towards democracy with military intervention? I suspect probably not. Military intervention, I think, is going to tend to block it. There have been steps forward without military intervention. In the original uprising, Tahrir Square, the only military intervention was to decide that they can't sustain their own dictator any longer, so they'll send him off to Sharm el-Sheikh with U.S. support and try to restore some degree of power. That's not military intervention. Unfortunately, the military was not tamed and controlled, and now it's taken power again. But wherever the military intervenes, I think it's almost inevitably going to be a regressive step. But there was progress in Egypt. I think some of it remains. It's threatened, but it remains. Tunisia, same story. Ennahda, the governing Islamic party, has just kind of backed off in the last couple of days, in fact, seems to be allowing more openness of participation. I think that's a good thing. In Syria, what began as a democratic uprising was crushed by brutal violence and became a vicious civil war, which is driving the country to suicide. It doesn't have to happen. In the dictatorships, the oil dictatorships, the ones that the U.S. and its allies really care about, there were some, Saudi Arabia in particular, there were small efforts to join the Arab Spring, very small. So calling something on Friday, the so-called Day of Rage. But that was crushed so quickly that people in Riyadh were afraid to go out into the streets. In eastern Saudi Arabia, where most of the oil is, and it happens to be a largely Shiite population, there have been continual uprisings, brutally suppressed. The U.S. backs it, of course. In Bahrain, kind of the same. Not much in the other Emirates. those remained what's called stable. They were the military regimes, clerical military regimes, were able to crush steps towards popular uprisings, but it may not be forever. Incidentally, that's not the only case. The Arab Spring actually began in a place that is rarely discussed, Western Sahara, Arab country. It's the last colony in Africa. It's under UN jurisdiction. It's supposed to undergo decolonization. And there's been, what happened is as soon as a move was made toward decolonization, I think 1975, Morocco invaded because they want it, and started sending in lots of Moroccans to try to overwhelm the domestic population. Pretty harsh repression and war, in some ways similar to Palestine, at the opposite end of the Arab world. Must have been October 2010, there was an uprising in Western Sahara, tent city, and the capital, with efforts to try to impose reforms. The Moroccans crushed it very quickly. The Sahrawis, the native population, took it to the UN Security Council, which is responsible for decolonization in the last colony. It was blocked in the Security Council by France, which is a supporter of Morocco with US support. But that was the first uprising in what became the Arab Spring. Is that finished? Not necessarily. Similar questions arise in Palestine, which is also basically colonized.
So we're now going to have our final question. And
thank you, Professor. My question would be regarding Hamas and why there has been an escalated anti-Hamas propaganda in the Egyptian media lately that surpassed the level that it was in the Mubarak regime, and what level did Hamas play in the Egyptian politics throughout the Morsi regime?
The anti-Hamas propaganda.
Yes.
And the anti-Palestinian propaganda in general under the current military regime.
Yes.
That's been pretty striking. It wasn't so great under Morsi. I mean, there were some hopes or expectations that under Morsi there might be a kind of an opening to Gaza, because the Hamas is kind of an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it was anticipated that there might be some opening of the border. Very little. I mean, I was actually there